Asea Tamakloe is a filmmaker, a lecturer at the National Film and Television Institute in Ghana, and a doctoral researcher at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. As a freelance editor, her works include award-winning films like Perfect Picture 2009 by Shirley Frimpong Manso, Chronicles of Odongom, The Headmaster 2014 by Ernest Kofi Abekwayo. She was also assistant editor for the films Who's Afraid of Ngugi by Mantia Diawara and Freetown 2015 by Garrett Barty. Asea Tamakloe is co-programmer for Film Africa, London's biggest celebration of African and African diaspora cinema, and was the festival manager of the European Film Festival Ghana. She founded the Ndiva Women's Festival for the presentation and preservation of work by, for, and about women. Professor Kate Skinner is a historian with a particular interest in the 20th century West Africa and commitments to collaborative, interdisciplinary, and impactful research. She joined the University of Bristol History Department in 2023, having previously worked in interdisciplinary African studies at the University of Birmingham. Her first book focused on the connections between the expansion of formal schooling and mass literacy, new forms of political mobilization, and competing ideas about citizenship in the Ghana-Togo borderlands. These interests were further developed in collaborative book project with Prof. Wilson Yayo, University of Cape Coast, Ghana, which focused on print cultures in the Ghana-Togo borderlands, and particularly on Ewe language. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Newspaper titled, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it is The Key to Freedom, is the English translation. Most recently, Kate Skinner has worked on histories of gender activism, and she's particularly interested in the politics of law reform in post-colonial Ghana. Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofu, who presented previously at the forum but who can't be here today, is Professor of African and Gender Studies at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. She's an activist scholar, her work being informed by her faith and a commitment to social gospel. Her areas of interest include African knowledge systems, higher education, race and identity politics, masculinities, and popular culture, and at the heart of her work are questions of identity and power. In 2005, she became the foundation director of the University Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy. And from 2010 to 2015, she was a director of the Institute of African Studies. Professor Ampofu is a founding vice president and immediate past president of the African Studies Association of Africa, an honorary professor at the Department of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Birmingham, and a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Ampofu sits on the organization of many boards in Ghana and internationally. She's also a member of the Network for Women's Rights and Domestic Violence Coalition. She's editor-in-chief, Contemporary Journal of African Studies, and co-editor, Critical Investigations into Humanitarianism in Africa blog. Her most recent book, co-edited with Josephine Beko-Betts, is titled Producing Inclusive Feminist Knowledge, Positionalities and Discourses in the Global South. I now give over the floor to our presenters today. Are you unmuted, Prof. Skinner?
I'm just unmuting myself. Yeah. So I'll just say a few words about how I came to meet Asea, and then maybe Asea will say a few words, and then I think we go straight to the film. So I had not initially worked on gender activism, but I had stumbled across purely by chance some old newspapers from the mid-1960s which were addressing the issue of child maintenance, and it began to strike me that women mobilizing around particular issues and legal reform had quite a long history in Ghana. And so I wanted to get into researching on this theme, and I had met Prof. Adomako Ampofu just briefly, but I knew that she was much more, she was very heavily involved in this field and had been writing for a long time on gender issues. So I asked her if she might want to do a kind of collaborative project. And we were eyeing a scheme that was funded by the British Academy, where they specifically wanted international collaborations and they wanted humanities and social science partnerships. So the scheme seemed to fit what we wanted to do. And we kind of both agreed that, especially for the 1970s and 80s, there was a bit of a gap in knowledge about women's organising, women in public life, issues around which women were mobilising, how they mobilised, and so on and so forth. So we kind of had our funding scheme in mind and we had our topic. And then Prof said to me, "Oh, but Kate, how many people will read our journal articles? Will it be 50 if we're lucky?" So she said, "Why don't we think about doing a documentary film? It's going to reach a lot more people." So I said, "Well, I think that's a really intriguing idea, but I have no idea how to make a documentary film. I am out of my depth." At which point Prof said, "Aha, but I know someone who will be able to come on board with us." And that is how I met Aseye and how the film project really took shape. So shall I just hand to you, Aseye, to say a few more words about the film before we start watching?
Okay, so hello everyone again. And interestingly, I met Prof. Skinner one of my film festival events in 2018, Indiva Women's Film Festival that's hosted in Accra. And she had attended the festival, I think on 2 different days with Prof. Tamakloe, and the conversation started. And we've been at it till date. And so briefly about the film, the film is shot entirely in Ghana, but it's made up of interviews, historical footage, archival footage, photographs, animations, etc. And it's, even though we have 16 women speaking in the film, we have a lot more women in that film. And I won't be a spoiler, so I'll let people watch and we'll take it from there. But it was a glorious experience. It's been an experience of a lifetime for all of us. So I spent a couple of years making this film, and we're glad we're beyond this, doing very well. Thank you.
Freedom! Freedom!
The CPP had merged 2 women's organizations into the National Council of Ghana Women.
I became editor of the Daily Graphic in 1979 at a very chaotic period in our history. They came to the offices of the Graphic and ransacked my office.
When my husband died, the first question my junior husband, who is highly educated, asked me, even before my husband was married, whether my husband has fully died with me. Professor,
no human being should be expected to countenance, absorb, or tolerate violence.
To do a nationwide research on violence against women and children was a major achievement. It was no mean thing.
As to this idea that gender equality issues are Western inspired and African women are just copying from the West, in a certain sense, it's a term of abuse thrown at activists whose issues we do not like.
If you are convicted of being a feminist, will there be enough evidence to convict you?
I would challenge anybody who says that the issues that are being raised, violence, discriminatory practices that are being perpetuated in the name of culture, are foreign issues. You just have to look around you to see that these are live issues in our country.
When you talk about a sense of injustice, a sense of feeling you've been badly done by because you are a woman, and that is articulated today, we'd say, with impunity. But we did not have that vocabulary at that time. You were just embarrassed.
At every point in time in history, women have been blamed for disasters. If you are a rich woman, you are accused of being a witch. If you are poor, you are accused of being a witch. If you talk too much, you are a witch. If you don't talk, you are a witch.
And that's the trouble with being a woman. When you are in a position, you are on trial virtually every single day.
If you're a woman and you're not ugly and you're not stupid, of course, all sorts of things get said about you.
Participatory democratic systems with no women in there, that is democracy for the men, as usual.
Anything concerning women has always been given the least position in priority ranking.
As to this idea that gender equality issues are Western inspired and African women are just copying from the West, in a certain sense, it's a term of abuse thrown at activists whose issues we do not like.
If you are convicted of being a feminist, will there be enough evidence to convict you?
Freedom! Freedom! Freedom!
Ghana, land of freedom, toils of the brave, and the sweat of their labors, toils of the brave, which have brought results.
Gender activism in Ghana definitely has gone through many phases. If you look at the 1950s and 60s activism, I think it was a lot of welfare. Activism. Women organized themselves to support their own economic and social activities. They were also very interested in national affairs. If you recall, the CPP had merged two women's organizations into the National Council of Ghana Women. And the National Council was very interested in national politics and women's place in national politics. And also they were interested in supporting the CPP's efforts and to develop Ghana.
Women have certain special, unique attributes that they bring to their work, and which men don't have. And men also have certain unique attributes which they bring to their work, which women don't have. And you need the two together if you want full development in your country.
Mrs. Jaggi was somebody who really pushed issues. She told me that she became a High Court judge because of Nkrumah. She said there was some national function or other, and Nkrumah came out, and the Chief Justice, Kosa, came out, with him and introduced the judges one after the other. And when Nkrumah got to her, he said, "Are you a High Court judge yet?" And she said, "No." And he turned to Justice Kosa and said, "Why haven't you made a one?" And he said, "Oh, said in Britain doesn't even have one." And said, "They are slow about it. Why should we be slow about it?" And he said, Mr. President, High Court judges are addressed as my lord, and I can't see myself addressing somebody's wife as my lady. And so he asked Mrs. Jaggi whether she minded being addressed as my lord. And she said no. He said, make her one. In 1965, I finished my PhD and came and started teaching at Legon. But at the time I got back, one Mrs. Gloria Ayi, who used to be the headmistress of Accra Girls Secondary School, started the Voltairean Association. That is, women from graduates from Legon who were working mostly in the public service and also as teachers and heads of schools. The main issue was how to support secondary school students, you know, in advising them on courses that they can do, whether after secondary school they will come to the university or go to a teacher training college or go into nursing, you know, careers available for girls who leave secondary school. When we've been around for about 3 years, we then organized this Voltairean Association into Ghana Association of University Women, GAUW. And the main focus was supporting girls' education.
This coup was carried out completely because of the things that had happened in Ghana, the tyranny and the despotism of Kwame Nkrumah, the deposed president. Everybody in Ghana was fed up with it.
I was in secondary school when the 66 coup happened. I didn't fully understand it. I was only like, what, 14? But I remember in Kumasi, they used to bus people from villages to come to the center of Kumasi and to the market to jubilate that Kwame Nkrumah had been overthrown. In the long vacation of 66, I was walking with my mother. In fact, we were going to her goldsmith, jeweler, and in Edum. And then we got to a spot, and I saw like a tent, a military tent, one of those green tents. And I saw some soldiers standing. So I raised my eyes to kind of understand where exactly we were. And the soldier said, I should come, that they had arrested me. And I said, why? He said, why did I look up? I said, where have they said we cannot look up? And then, you know, imagine a 14-year-old. I put my hand here. Eventually, the soldiers released me. Said, next time. I said, next time I pass, I will look.
Once the CPP was overthrown, we got into a period where women's organizations were not particularly concerned or involved in national politics in that way. They were more concerned with everyday things and more about themselves and the conditions of women and the conditions of disadvantaged women and so on. By the late 70s into the 80s, when I became active, I would say that there was quite a thick movement, broad, most connected with issues of discrimination. If you remember, this was a period in which women like Ketabam raised the issue of widowhood rights.
Mrs. Ketabam, she had then lost her husband. And it was talk in Ghana here, the humiliation that her status she went through when she lost her husband. Virtually everything was taken away from her. So that pushed all of us.
By the time we got to university, 71, the Busia government was in power. They had floated the dialogue with South Africa, which had been seen as quite unpopular. And then January 72, we had the Achampong coup.
The takeover was occasioned principally by the hypocrisy of the Busia regime, coupled with the inefficient management by that regime of our economy.
As I recall, I don't believe that I was overly anxious that a democracy had been overthrown. What excited all of us was the kind of radical posture of the government, you know, because the city had been devalued and our debt had racked up. So you had a government which came up with a policy of yentia, we will not pay, a repudiation of the debt. And we found it very exciting and we demonstrated in support of it. Then there was all this Operation Feed Yourself, Operation Feed Your Industry. So there was this economic nationalism when we thought that really nothing much was happening. The soldiers had become corrupt. They were just amassing wealth and there was a lot of brutality and there was really no traction anywhere. That's when we turned against them. And we were involved in a lot of confrontations and the university was closed a number of times. The campus would be invaded by soldiers. And if I remember, there was one demonstration, we called it Kilometer 101. They met us around the Ghana Standards Board at dawn. And they said they had been sent there all night. They were tired, and it was about 5 a.m., 5:30. We said, no, we are not tired. If they are tired, they should go home and sleep. And they had their bayonets and were dancing right in front of the bayonets, etc. You know, and of course, these demonstrations did not just reflect our own dissatisfactions. By and large, they were reflecting a lot of popular dissatisfaction with the regime.
You can criticize the government, then we will set up. But don't destroy. See, when you know what you are writing is wrong.
National Council on Women and Development, it was started in 1975. Yeah, and 1975 was International Women's Year. The UN declared 1975 the decade for women. Mm-hmm. And every country was supposed to establish some structure that will make sure that they promote the emancipation of women and women's involvement in public affairs and so on.
Mrs. Sani Jagi was instrumental in seeing to the establishment of the national machinery. General Ike Achampong, who was then the head of state, in a radio broadcast, informed the nation that she was going to establish a national machinery for women.
Mrs. Jagi was the chairman and I was vice chairman. I think I got nominated for it because of the Association of University Women. One of the things that sort of became my responsibility was to make sure that all the women's professional organizations particularly were registered properly and recognized. The impact that these various organizations had on the women was incredible. The women bankers, for example, they were the ones who introduced market women to wearing aprons so they don't crash their CD notes.
And in 1975, Women Journalists Association was created for the first time in this country. It was led by Mrs. Kate Abam. So she tried to bring us together, a lot of the women journalists at the time.
Mrs. Jagi said that education is important. Those were the days when they take a whole bag full of CDs to the bank. and the bank staff will count for them and record it for them. And you never know how many the CDs didn't actually get counted or whatever. So Mrs. Jaggi was insisting that they should organize evening classes for women. I remember Mrs. Oklu insisted that if we should go around the country and asking women what they really needed, they will tell you they wanted to be financially independent. Mrs. Oklu was the lady who established Nkulenu Industries and the first woman to be, processing food items commercially, canning them and exporting them and so on.
I have rubbed shoulders with women all my lifetime, since my school days up to when I was working for the government. They were giving me my due respect. I started the Ghana Manufacturers Association, and there are only about 4 women out of over 100. And whenever we go out to these meetings, we stand equal chance. On the whole, it's not bad.
Mrs. Sani Jaggi, she mobilized resources in the form of aid to establish cooperatives for women. I recall the first Gary processing factory, which was established at Masi.
While we were trying to help women as establishing factories for producing palm oil, producing smoked fish, it was Mrs. Oklu who, in 1975, when they had the first conference, she raised the issue that the biggest problem that women entrepreneurs have is capital, because they don't have any properties most of the time to guarantee them loans and so on. And the discussion after that conference in Mexico brought about the establishment of Women's World Banking. This Women's World Banking was started, and Mrs. Oklu made it a point to make sure that they performed well, because it was Ghana's special gift to the world, as it were.
Before the 1975 International Women's Year celebration, a lot of seminars were organized to sensitize the women about the conference, to collate their views, and these informed Ghana's report to the meeting.
A lot of people do not know this, but until 1979, a married woman could not get a passport without their husband's consent. And it was one of the things that NCWD really worked hard on. I think the National Council for Women and Development did a lot of work.
When the passport form said you needed your husband's consent to get a passport, I said, why? And the director of passport said, that's how it has always been. I said, well, it has to change. I'm not getting my husband's permission to get a passport. I'm an individual in my own right. Why? At that time, I was very small. I think he just looked at me and said, this girl is too much of a problem. He took it. Then they issued me with a passport. When I was teaching, during the Achampon regime especially, they had informers in the class who informed on all your teaching. I think they even took your lecture notes to them or something. How did I know? The judiciary celebrated 100 years of existence in Ghana, and we were all invited to the castle then. I was told before I went that Achampon never forgot names, even if he didn't know faces. and the lawyers were all in there. When he was greeting, I was with just the late Justice Oleno and General Okai. Justice Oleno introduced me by name. He stopped, looked at me, and said, "But you are a very young girl." So Okai said, "What has she done?" So they say she insults me in class all the time at the university. So I said, "Was anything that I had said untrue?" He said, "No." Then Oleno said, "Well, then she wasn't insulting you. She was speaking the truth." And he moved on. That was the one experience I had.
The market culture, which had always been dominated by females in this country. The issues that came up with the market, and when they go and bring goods from across the country and sleep on these trucks, and their stories were difficult stories. It is knowing those stories that made me so angry when 1979 came. And market women were being targeted as the people who were, what was their name? Kalabole. My view was that it was the military, after all, that had been in power since January 1972. They had led us into the mess. So why should I now suddenly think that the military had some big answer? No, I didn't stop to think about it. I did not.
The soldiers did not understand why the market queens could take things in bulk. Before the coup, plantain farmers will bring their produce to the markets. When that farmer is coming, or when that wholesaler is coming, we didn't have hotels as we have them now. The wholesaler knows nobody, so the queen mother for plantain will then have to take charge of the whole bulk. The queen mother will break the bulk and give to family heads within the market system. The queen mother has to stand surety and make sure that she collects all the money and pay the money to the wholesaler. Dealing with the soldiers, I taught the women to look at the twine that has been woven, yes, and to take note of the color, because they were not going to be able to read the names. They can't read the numbers, but at least the stripes here and the color of that they can describe to me. And I got hearing. Some were disciplined,
but some also came to me to tell me that if I get dismissed, but I will not get dismissed because this is our era.
During the early stages of the revolution, when the Mokola market was razed to the ground, a lot of women were displaced. They were blamed for the food shortages in the country. Women were suffering generally. A memorandum was signed from the NCWD, spearheaded by the then chairperson, Mrs. Annie Diake, to government, the military government, to ensure that women do not suffer unduly. In the memorandum, the NCW pleaded for the women who have been displaced because of the raising down of the Mokola Woman One market. Eventually, the new Mokola was built, and was able to house some of the women.
I became editor of the Daily Graphic in 1979 at a very chaotic period in our history. It was, okay, so where does one start with these things? Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings had attempted to stage a coup d'etat and had failed and was being tried. He and his wife were friends of mine and ours. When he was being tried, I was at the trial in Burma camp every day. And anyway, everybody knows what then happened. Then there was a violent overthrow of the military regime then, with whom I had had a very difficult relationship. I had been writing a column in the Graphic, which I called Thinking Aloud. Aloud, not A-L-O-U-D, but you are allowed to think. And there were times when, for weeks, I couldn't get my article published because the editor would send it to the Ministry of Information and they would say no. We used to have a joke about my unpublished works. But anyway, so this was me. It was well known that I had become quite a critic of the government. It was in the midst of all this that the Jerry Rawlings coup happened. A few days later, we were at work when the Commissioner Afre, who was the Commissioner for Information, came to tell me that I was being appointed editor of the Graphic. In those days, that was it. You've been appointed and that's it. Okay, so I became editor. Then they killed these people, Champong and Utuka. And I just thought, no. So I wrote an editorial saying they were out of order. And it made a lot of people unhappy because the general tone seemed to be, what was the slogan? Let the blood flow, let the blood flow. And some people took it personally that I was trying to stop the blood from flowing. And I was, people felt that people had done wrong and they should be killed. And anyway, there were demonstrations. They came to the offices of the Graphic and ransacked my office, and there were, you know, everywhere, on the walls in Legon, all the way to the Graphic, all the way to the stadium, everywhere. He or he must die, he or he must go, all those things. Let the blood flow. Well, we held our nerves. And in a way, the flight lieutenant himself held his nerve, I suppose you could say, because he was under a lot of pressure to remove me, because people felt that I was not sympathetic to the revolution. In fact, one of the soldiers said to me that he had noticed that I had never called it a revolution.
There can be no revolution unless the people, all of us, really understand what it is all about, and springing from that understanding, genuinely commit our support to it.
The Graphic was doing recipes and fashion and that on the women's page because there was no direction. But the minute we entered 1975 International Women's Year, that is when it hit all of us that we should refocus and bring real issues of women to the forefront. And so there was a bit of a shifting in what we were doing on that page. And so issues like widowhood rights, issues like treatment to widows and their children when their husbands die intestate, family planning, too many children, some being abandoned, no education. You know, those are the issues that traditionally they were not discussed, but we wanted to bring in. And with Elizabeth also made quite a good impression on Graphic generally, especially the editorial, because she was quite outspoken and quite a firm lady and in the editorial section. It gave us, all the women in editorial, that kind of edge to be also to be able to speak up in the columns or whatever reporting that we were doing. And I tell you what, I wrote an article on, I think it was on polygamy or something like that. And do you know what my own dad said to me? I shouldn't have written the article when he read it the next morning. That if I had discussed it with him or if I had sought opinion, he would have asked me not to write that kind of. So now thinking back, it's because he was guilty. He was practicing it and he thought it was right.
The people of Ghana have democratically elected me. I call on all in the true spirit of patriotism to come together as one united country, determined to solve the many and difficult problems facing us.
Miss Elizabeth Ohene was the editor of the Daily Graphic at the time, and Ajoy Ebuaferi was the editor, first as assistant editor of the Mirror, and then later on she became editor of the Mirror. Names that you had seen and heard before coming into that space, and you felt that you wanted to be like them. Elizabeth Ohene at the time was extremely strong, very vocal and principled. So I actually started the page, and I used that page in raising issues of concern to women, looking at women in a much more broader sense the role they play in society in terms of their leadership and also what they brought to the table as women. So basically looking at women beyond their household responsibilities and so on. But there was, even within the features department, you felt a sense of not being treated equal. It started dawning on me that there was something about discrimination. I hadn't studied women's rights or anything, but you began to feel in the workplace that something was not right. And also you began to see the ways in which, like if you go to do a story, you saw the disparities between the things that women did and what men did.
When we started at the peak of activism in Ghana, so back home in Takwa, we were linked to the new democratic movements over there. And Ibrahim, the late Ibrahim Isaac Haku, who was then at Legon, was our leader. And all that we were doing was to try to understand Ghana. If you come to Takwa, where we lived, we used to have meetings in my father's house. And then we used to have meetings in Ibrahim's house. That's the New Democratic Movement. We knew the BNI officials, and most of the time they were stationed at some point looking into our house. That was the time that people like Akuto Ampao, Kwame Kakari, some other leaders were arrested by the regime for planning against them. And we still wanted to be relevant. When we were having debates as to whether we should move into a partisan political group or remain as an activist group to monitor the activities of politicians, the Women Caucus, Annette and myself, Juji and Techuas and all of them, we met and then discussed, and then we saw that no, it's better for us to be a force to reckon with rather than moving into partisan politics. And people who didn't want that position drifted into politics, and later on they saw that they were consumed by the whole process. But then the organization remained.
About 1992, when I left to go to the US, and around the time I was leaving to go to the US, most of the people I was representing were in prison. And these were people who had been tried under military tribunals in set up by the PNDC. And it was very difficult to get appeals for them, because one of the things you need in an appeal is to get a record of proceedings of the original trial. And many of these trials, there were no records of proceedings. So it was really difficult. And the tribunals were difficult. They gave people very harsh sentences, death, life imprisonment, 25 years, And I remember when I was in the US feeling very happy when some of the people that I had been representing would write to me to tell me that they have succeeded in their appeals. Of course, I came to do those cases because later on, some of our comrades in the NDM, they had fallen. It was so easy to fall afoul of the PNDC, and they had been arrested and jailed. And of course, even in prison, they continued with their activism. So they were the ones who brought these people who had been sentenced to these long terms in the tribunals to our notice.
The National Council on Women and Development, I was then in GBC when it started. The late Mrs. Jagi and co interviewed me, and they said I'm a perfect candidate. So immediately they employed me in May 1980. So that's when I joined the NCWD. And then I must say that I brought on board several programs that would change the lives of women. I dealt with NGOs. I dealt with so many issues.
The NCWD office in WA was opened far, far later. It was opened in 1984. Because in 1983, that we got the region created for us. When I was acting as the regional secretary of the office, because that was the title we were given. Around that time, women didn't used to feature so much at public functions. And women's ideas were not sought, because if anything, it is the men. You get to the villages, you call for a meeting to interact with the community members, and you see a few women. And the few women who will come will be at the back. Around that time is when we were championing the women in development concept.
One lady called Mrs. Obinim, Beatrice Obinim, came to see me in the house. I had never met her before. Mrs. Obinim told me that they want to set up an organization, a women's organization, but they want me to lead it. And I said, oh, no. I have tried to go to one that didn't really work, and so I didn't want to be the one to lead anything. And she said, well, because your husband is a military person, we can start with military wives. My position was that the women should be part of decision making. But they were more into just organizing women to be visible. We actually decided to inaugurate officially the organization and then vote for people to be the executives. That's how I became the president. So I had to sit down and write the aims and objectives. And I went to Mrs. Jaggi and she said, look at the 4 pointers of the United Nations Declaration on Women, that every woman should be developed politically, socially, economically, and culturally. And look at what you can do. We had market women's representatives, we had bakers representatives, we had business women representatives, military, police, prisons, they were all represented there. We cannot just have INCC and have the PDCs and WDCs and all the executives of those institutions didn't have any women. The committees for the defense of the revolution got upset with me, reported me to the boss of the committees for the defense of the revolution, which at the time called me and said to me, Mrs. Rawlings, are you aware that all the revolutionary organizations are under my office? I said, yes, I'm aware. And why do you leave and go to Volta region without my permission? And then I burst out laughing. I said, we are not a revolutionary organization. We are an organization for women that is helping to promote the image of women, advance the image of women, improve the political knowledge of women, and make sure that women have an economic activity. Even as near as areas around the Pram area, the Accra plains, women were not even allowed to farm with their implements. They had to use their bare hands because their farms shouldn't be bigger than their husbands' farms. So there were a lot of little things that I felt we could do to improve on it. And the only way was to go to every region and have a workshop with knowledgeable women that Mrs. Annie Jaggi suggested to me. People thought that I was doing all of this because I was getting money from the state. Not one CD. I was raising everything, but because of my position as a first lady, if I go to a conference, before I go, I'm asking who I can go and have a meeting with to see to certain things about children, see to certain things about women, women's work, how we can get equipment for them. I brought people from China, from Japan and all that. But I was able to do this because I was first lady. But some people are first ladies, they don't do anything. It's a matter of what you want to do.
One of the things that became clear was that because of the 31st December Women's Movement and Mrs. Rawlings's own involvement, it was impossible to overlook women's aspects in the life of PNDC, because the first was very strong. It was almost like a quasi-government organization, even though it was an NGO, but it held the same name as the revolution. So
Chanel, should I take over from here, or you would?
Yes, please.
Right.
Yes, please.
So thank you all very much. I think that we could have sat with this all through and through. These are interesting conversations about everything else women. So at this point, I think I would invite Professor Makoni to have a conversation with our women who made this video, and then we can open the floor for all of our comments and questions. Thank you. Prof. Makoni.
Okay, thank you very much. It was nice seeing Professor Florence Dolphine. She taught me linguistics at the University of Ghana. I didn't know a lot about this other side to her political activities. I thought she only knew syntax and phonology, but she seems to know quite, she was involved in a lot of other activities. I have a couple of questions which are directed, I think, to some extent at me, but you may help me answer them. When this project that you managed to successfully put together, what were the challenges that you faced as you tried to work from different parts of the world to produce this film? If you were to try to advise other individuals who may want to set up such collaborative projects, what lessons did you, what are the lessons that you got from this experience? Is Kate?
I'm with you. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Kate. Yeah. What is it that you would say? Okay, let me put it more dramatically. If you were to produce a handbook on what to do and what not to do in collaborative research, what would you include?
Yeah, so I'll tell you sort of how it seemed from my perspective, and then maybe Asaya can tell you how it looked from hers. So one of the interesting things about the project was the way COVID had come along, because at the beginning, I had anticipated spending a lot more time in Ghana and being more involved in the interviews. Like, I had never really envisaged being the lead interviewer or being a narrator for the documentary, but I had envisaged being there a lot more whilst the filmed interviews were being done. And that just didn't work out for several reasons, but one of them being COVID was that I just couldn't travel. So we'd kind of already agreed that Prof. Tamakloe would be the lead interviewer. So the way things worked out, I did a lot of work, sort of archival work, secondary literature, online newspapers. I did manage to get to the UN archives before COVID, and I did actually manage to get to some archives in Ghana before COVID as well. So in a way, I was using that archival research to formulate questions for interviewees. And then our postdoc, Jovia Salifu, he was doing something similar. So the questions, we would kind of draft questions beforehand and circulate them around so that the archival and secondary research could inform the questions, and then other perspectives could be brought to bear. Obviously, in the interviews themselves, we didn't stick really rigidly to a predetermined list of questions, but we did have kind of areas which we knew we would want to ask about. I wasn't there for the great majority of the interviews. I was there for Vicky Wirako's interview, and we did Marianne Taki's online. So I was only there for 2 of them. In a way, I think that was possibly a good thing, because I realised, I always knew I didn't know very much about film production, but in a way, the more the process went on, the more apparent it became to me how little I did know about it. And in a way, I think me not being there in some ways was possibly helpful, because it meant that those who did know more about filmmaking were kind of more clearly in charge of those elements and could do it the way they wanted to. Whereas perhaps if I'd been there, I would have been coming at things from a different perspective and sort of, in a way, getting a bit in the way of the process. So I suppose partly from this, the lesson I have taken is that as an academic, interviewing people as a kind of oral history project on your own is really different from doing filmed interviews that you intend to use for a documentary. Like, the methodology, on the face of it, looks the same, because fundamentally you're sitting down to talk to people, but it's not really the same. You're not really trying to generate the same type of material. And in that sense, I think I would probably advise academics to not assume that making a film means doing your own oral history methodology and just bringing a camera into the room whilst you're doing it. It's a lot more different than that. So you kind of have to be prepared to roll with the approach of the people who actually do know a lot more about filmmaking. I think I've probably said enough. Let me ask Aseye how it looked from her perspective. Yeah.
So it was a learning experience for all of us, even for me, who was already in film, because I'd worked more with people my kind in the industry. And so having to work with academics and knowing that the project started more on an academic footing before becoming something else. What I would say was that what helped us was that the 2 PIs for the project really showed real leadership, in that, one, they were really ready to learn. And so there was a lot of engagements. We had a lot of engagements, even in trying to choose the women. We had meetings, in-persons, etc. We had a tall list of about 50 women that eventually got reduced to this. Also, our postdoc also was very helpful. For some reason, I think there was a lot of cohesion. We just seem to have gelled really well. I've known Professor Adomako for many years. I used to be her student. I think I've known her since 2008 or 9. And she's also a mentor and like a second mother. So we have a relationship already. And all of us who came to the project also knew that it was crucial that we made this film. One, that we all realized that there's a gap. 2, also because I ran a women's film festival, I know how important for women's stories to be out there. And so was comfortable, uncomfortable, we worked through it. I remember one day I had Skinner and Prof. Adomako that we are making a film, we are not writing a textbook. And so we will have to learn to kill our darlings. And Prof will always use the word killing darlings, because we had about almost 60 hours of footage. And there were things that is said that the academics wanted. And there were things that the filmmaker also thought should be included. Find middle grounds every time. But the fact that everybody we were all ready to go the long haul. The film was supposed to have been a 20-minute film, but I had told them that it was not going to be possible. Our first cut was almost 4 hours, you know, and then we kept working it through and doing so much work. So this is one of the projects where I think that because we all wanted it so badly, whether we had any demons worry ever said, we just decided to just work hard and make that, you know, and by the time we had done our executive premiere, which was for screen to 4 different groups of people, at the time the film was about 70% ready, and we saw people's reaction, we knew we had gold, and we went back to work harder to finish it. So I know collaborations are hard because even as a filmmaker, I know that, you know, sometimes when you have to access certain fundings, you need to work with somebody else outside the continent, etc. And I remember one of the first things I learned when we had funding workshops was the way that whoever you're going to, especially when it comes to money, make sure that you will like each other for a long time, you know. But I also think that for the fact that we were all into some form of activism in whichever way, and we wanted the story told, and it had to be out there, we just worked hard at nailing it. So it was just, I think, a lot of collaboration, there weren't egos, which was great. So, and everybody was ready to learn, which also helped. Yeah.
Let me ask another question. And then after you've answered that question, I'll then ask you the question which I genuinely want to ask. This is for everybody else. Now, when you look into the future, you have done this particular project. Some of the women that you interviewed, Florence Dolphin, let's say, Jerry Rawlings' wife, and all those other individuals, have they ever watched this film, and what have they said about the film generally? What were their comments?
Hey, do you want to take it before me?
Well, you go first this time. I'll follow you. Yeah.
They were actually part of the people who we called for the executive premiere, we called it the first screening. Also, ethically, they had to see themselves before we put it out there. So they were happy, they were glad. I remember Elizabeth Wakini said, "Did I see all of that?" You know, but I think that they actually wanted this. As I look back on how they received it, the different screenings they went to, the different programs they had been invited to, connected to the film, and how they've responded. Even looking at, even when we're speaking to them, when we're interviewing them, because the list, I think, was 2.5 hours. That's the shortest interview we had. Mrs. Rawlings was like almost about 6 hours going to 7. We had 5 hours, 4 hours. We had, I think the list, it's not even 2 hours, 3 hours, yes. 3 hours was the list we had. So it was, I think they had things to say because they've also done a lot of work. And I'm sure has been speaking to them about the work itself, you know, and the process. So one that they were grateful. I remember we had a screening at our National Theatre. It was full to the brim. National Theatre had to tell people to stop coming, you know. And I remember Mrs. Apalu's children, Professor Dolphin was there, and other people. Actually, their children actually came to us to say that they were grateful that their mothers, and that their mothers are also very grateful that these stories are out there and that people will know what they've done. And also that thankfully we have the transcripts and it's in public domain. And so this is just a quarter of even what they have said that we've seen on screen. And so they received it really well, actually. Problem, yes.
See, because the little linguistics that I know I was taught by Florence Dolphin when she was the only lecturer in the linguistics department, and everybody in the 80s was gone. And she normally used to come to teach, and she looked very tired, but she was still very committed to it. That if I were to interview her and talk to her about her academic career now, I think I'll have better questions to ask her about how she managed to balance all this work that she was involved in terms of women activism, because there was a time she rose to become the deputy vice chancellor at the University of Ghana, but she still was coming in to teach. And it is that balance, for example, that still strikes me when I listened to her talking, how she was able to balance all these things. Okay, now my next question is, what is your next project? And if I were to find funding and I said to you, I would like your expertise and help in putting together a film based on the YouTubes that we have compiled for the last 2, 3, 4 years, what would your answer be? And you see, unlike you, we have got all these interviews we have done with Kofi Anyidoho, Audrey Gajepo, a lot of different people, but we have been playing around with the idea of trying to make this into a film. So you have a film that deals with decoloniality, Southern epistemologies, etc. But every time I think about it, I shudder to think about it because I know nothing about a lot of things and I don't know anything about film. So what advice would you give us?
Am I just being offered a job? I think that one, it's a brilliant idea. Do not shy away from it, even though the journey can be tough, arduous, and tears and blood. We have cried as well. So okay. Yes, but I think that it's possible. For started, I think that you will have to start from a place of, because you've got a lot of material, and a lot has been said in the different interviews you've had or the different sessions you've had with people. And so what exactly what's the idea? What do you want to say?
What do you want to say? Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Because I mean, when it comes to film, especially for documentary filmmaking, after you've recorded everything, the story again when you start editing and putting it together. So certain things will change, here and there. So you may have a target, you may sort of stick to it, but not 100%. You meander and still get there. So it's knowing what you want to say.
Okay.
The impacts, because at the end, what's the film supposed to do? Basically, films appeal to our emotions. By the time they finish appealing to our emotions, they get to our hearts and our heads. And then where there's a call to action, it starts, because there's this interesting relationship between our brain and the screen or the images we see and what we get out of it. So all of that comes to play. But also that's at the end, there's also the thing about documentation, something that we haven't done so well as a continent, But thankfully, you've already started where we're recording this. It's put online, so it's in the cloud. So thankfully, it's not going to disappear. But now the intentionality of putting it together, so being intentional about the message, which is another thing, because out there in the bigger space, and especially where the North is concerned, there's always an agenda as to what to put out there. Something we also sometimes haven't totally considered, but so there has to be intentionality. And like our film, people have asked that, why didn't we see conflict screaming all over? When you watch it to the end, you will see that there were some conflicts. There were issues that had to be fans in the room, but the stand we took also was that we were not going to follow the cliche of women fight each other, etc., etc. So we want to, first of all, work that has been done, the process, and because most of the time you don't even know about the process, all of this. So there was intentionality of how we presented it. So when we come to what you want to do, there's also has to be some intentionality about what you want to present.
What you want to accomplish.
All of that,
okay.
yes. So it's actually layered. And it's how you get to all those layers. And so it's about spending time with the material and then understanding the material beyond just what you see. So you don't take it at face value. You may read a first, second, third meaning, and then you decide how you want to put it together. But also that if you get somebody who's working for you, you have to try to trust the person as well. So but there has to be a lot of collaboration, a lot of talking.
A lot of talking.
A lot of learning and unlearning. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay, Dorothy, let me give over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your initial comments and questions. This, by way of information, if you have any question or comment, you might want to use the raise hand function or perhaps type it in the chat box and I'll read it out to our presenters. There's one here from Chanel that she wants to know whether you had a research question at the start of the project and did it change as you went along? And how did you decide on the themes that went into the final film?
On the research question, I saw that come up in the chat and I'm literally just looking back to the original project application because you do normally specify your research question. We did have project objectives. One was around kind of archiving gender activism and more broadly women in public life in post-colonial Ghana, in order to generate resource that other researchers, educators and students could use. So that was kind of a component of it. The other one was addressing gaps in our knowledge about Ghanaian women's organising and campaigning strategies under military, single-party and short-lived multi-party governments, and how Ghanaian women negotiated national priorities, cultural particularities, universalist ambitions, and the international women's movement. Another objective was challenging the representation of women as passive bearers of a timeless and essentialized African culture and reshaping public understanding of women's activism as part of national history and international relations. And the last one was around informing public and policy debate in the period when the affirmative action bill was being, well, it was being debated, but it was being pushed backwards and forwards from cabinet to parliament and back. And there were a lot of delays. And Asaya was just telling me yesterday that the affirmative action bill is now back in Parliament under a certificate of emergency. So those were the kind of objectives that we started out with. And alongside the film, we worked on journal articles, blog posts. So there were quite a few outputs beyond the film, but the film was kind of a really major component of the project.
Right. Thank you very much, Kate. Ashraf, I see your hand up. Can you pose your question now?
Thank you very much, Asya and Kate. We did enjoy the movie. It's a very interesting experience, I think, for all of us. I have three questions. 2 questions to you and the third question to Symphony. The first question is about the categories of women who were excluded from this movie. Do you think that there are specific categories were not included because what we saw actually in the movie are educated women, male educated women, professors, journalists, and so on. Are there other categories apart from this category that were not included in the movie and why they're excluded. And the second question is how you, asking Kate, how did you mark your subjectivity in this movie, apart from the technical issue of selecting and putting together? These are two questions to you. The third question is to Simfrey. Simfrey, and to anyone else. How now we know that the Global Virtual Forum, produces books, from these recordings. How are we going to deal with this event, with this session? If we're going to produce a chapter about it. Thank you very much.
I'll leave this to Kate to answer first, then I will try and address Ashraf's question.
I might call on Aseo to help me. I think in terms of who is not in the film, I think when we started out, we possibly had, I don't want to say that we had the ambition to be comprehensive, because any film is by definition going to be selective. You can't have everybody and everything in a film. So it was never going to be comprehensive in the sense that choices were always going to have to be made, because you only have so much money and you only have so much time. When we started out, we did have an ambition to have in the film a segment which would be based on film work done in the northeast of Ghana, which is where our postdoc came from. And he had done his MA dis looking at women who were kind of active much more at the local level in northeastern Ghana. And he had met quite a few older women who had been heavily involved in 31st in the district that he came from, and so on. So initially we did have this idea that the rather sort of city focused, kind of English speaking, formally educated kind of selection of women for the interviews, that we would have a kind of a different slice, if you like. That ended up not happening because of COVID. There was periods where travel between cities was just too difficult. We had kind of, issues around, institutional sort of policies around risk assessment and things like this that we had to factor in. So we didn't end up doing that slice, which we had wanted to do. All that said, there are some parts later on in the film where we look at women's activism in mining communities in Western region. So it's not exactly the same as what we envisage, but it's, it's outside of Accra at least. I think, though, we get this question every time that the film is screened, and that's why I think on the flyer, I had talked about the politics of representation, because, you asked me about my subjectivity, and there's a kind of a very obvious dynamic there. Are you a white person coming with your particular view of feminism, and this is the prism through which you view everything in Ghana, and you're going to end up telling people stories for them in ways that don't really even make sense to them, because you've got this kind of outsider's prism. So I think there's a kind of that's an obvious kind of dimension, if you like, to the process of working through who gets to tell whose stories and who gets to represent whom. But one of the things that was very interesting to me was that, leaving aside that whole question of me as somebody who's not Ghanaian coming to involve myself in telling these stories, there's also an awful lot of politics around who gets to tell whose stories, even when you're talking about Ghana on its own. So when this film was screened at ASA, which is the big African Studies conference in the States in 2020, we got questions from people who said that, it was basically like a Southern women's takeover, speaking for Northern women, or re-marginalizing Northern women. We've also consistently had this idea that educated women are an unrepresentative minority. And so to me, these kinds of questions and discussions, they have stimulated a lot of thinking about the politics of representation, because I think we're often not very clear whether, when we talk about representation, do we mean it descriptively, or do we mean it substantively, or do we mean it in another way? So I'll give you an example of what I mean. It is obvious that most of the women interviewed for the film, they are not descriptively representative of Ghanaian women. They have typically higher levels of formal education. They have a higher socioeconomic status. They're more urban. So they're not descriptively representative. But then does that mean that their stories don't speak to other Ghanaian women? Like, do they need to be descriptively representative of this national population of women in order for their stories to be valid, or to be worth hearing, or to be of interest to women who are not like them? Because I think ultimately for me, in the end, part of the point of telling stories, it's partly about yourself, what you want to say about yourself in your life, but it's also partly about telling it to people who are not like you, so that maybe they can understand you. So that's what I would say to people. I'm not going to deny that the women in our film are not descriptively representative, but I would ask, how far is that a problem rather than a simple statement of fact? The other thing I would say, and this is something which is going to come through in the publications, like the more academic publications on the project, is that I think we need to be very wary about how educated women in Ghana are critiqued as unrepresentative. Because in the archival research for the project, we found a lot of patterns that when women with, relatively speaking, higher levels of education would raise issues around, say, treatment of widows, the same criticism was always used to shut them down. And the criticism was always, oh, but you people are an educated minority. You're unrepresentative. You've become westernized because of your education. You're not kind of embracing our culture. So these kind of arguments are very powerful as a way of shutting down women in Ghana who want to raise issues, accusing people of being kind of an unrepresentative westernized minority. It's a very powerful tactic of silencing or delegitimating. And I think Georgie Chikata got at that right at the beginning of the film when she said the idea that women in Ghana are just copying from Western feminism. I mean, it's obviously not true, but it's also, why do people say these things? Why do they want to emphasize those things? Who benefits from categorizing women's activism in that way? So, I mean, I think your question is very important, because to me, this whole project pushed that thinking about the politics of representation, which I think I was aware of at the beginning of the project, but I didn't feel it all or see all the different dimensions of it, which became apparent as we went along. I'll stop there and let Aseye come in.
I'll take it from, so the Jewish Holocaust, we know the story, the history, and we know that we're told about the Jewish Holocaust. And, but there are over 100 films, documentaries, many written, unwritten, told about the Jewish Holocaust. It's an event that happened, that shouldn't happen. But people have come at it from different angles. It's the same situation here, where, for starters, in documenting and telling women's histories, activism and the different strands of activism, and also looking at it from pre-independence, independent, post-independent, through the other regimes. There are many stories. We cannot tell every story. We have actually just scratched the surface because there are so many things that have happened. But what I've come to realize in our attempt to scratch the surface, I know that other people are attempting to do other things in this space because we sort of have nudged people into a certain, or poked people into a certain truth that there's work to be done. So people are waking up and people are trying to get work done. Now, I always ask, who has a license to tell whose story? But beyond that, why shouldn't an educated woman's story matter? And why should it? But what I always tell people is that if you critically watch this film and from beginning to end, you realize that most of these women, there was a process of becoming when they started work in this space in their different strands of activism. Some were not as educated as they have become now, you know. So they have also become in the process. And in that becoming, one thing I actually like about, or I appreciate about Ghanaian women's organizing is that there's always a stretch where people in the classroom, people outside the classroom, from the grassroots, there's always a way in which they come together. So much events that you hear about and know about have a combination of people and that's just how it is. Recently, Professor Skinner was telling me that she's always intrigued at how Ghanaian women have organized over the years, because even from where she's coming from, there have been eras and waves, you know, but even that is segregated in a certain way, but the way in which people are able to pull forces. And she was saying that she's so amazed at the fact that if you meet a Ghanaian woman who is hitting 40-something or 50-something, they have been part of a certain women's association somehow, about 1, 2, 3, or 4 before even hitting 40, which is true. As I sit here, I'm also a member of the Forum for African Women Educationists chapter. So it's not about just educated women being given a platform, but the fact that their stories also must be told, which also are stories, because even when you see some of the footage, the video, the archival material, you see, and I don't like to use the word ordinary women, but the women that what is in the film are also represented. I mean, by our first opening shot, the women the market women who were organizing for Kwame Nkrumah, and they are in the film. They may not be speaking, Georgie may have been speaking for them, but they are all represented there. So if the attention is always supposed to be, and it falls back actually into the storytelling that we are used to, what colonialism has brought and what we still have, the relics, because there's always a thing that we need to speak to the supposed grassroots person, you know, and most of the time these films will have to be about woman from some village who is trying to make a difference, and, you know, that's what should be hailed. But the other woman who probably was once from the village, has come to the city, is doing well, but also has a story to tell. So there's all of that mixed up there somewhere. And so I think in all of this is where our subjectivity also comes through. in trying to tell this story? Where do you stand, your positionality, and who is speaking for who? And the reason why we made sure that we didn't have anything like a narrator or a third voice, we wanted people to speak their truth to camera. And it was an intentional decision so that nobody's taking anybody's voice, and in that process, delegitimizing anybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, I think that when you were speaking, Kate, as well, when you were speaking, I think I was thinking about it as a particular intervention that needed to be done at a certain point in time to sort of like open doors for other things that could be done. So I am sure that when these questions come to delegitimize and perhaps try to poke holes and make it less of a work that needs to be celebrated or perhaps to be looked up to for other things to be done, we don't have to succumb to those and push back with the fact that it's a particular intervention that needed to be done. And once that intervention was done, it opens more doors for other things to be done. And I think that this thing with a particular grassroots story that needs to be told is something that we're grappling with in a project that you and I own about African urbanism, the fact that this is urban, this is rural, this is African, this is European. That dichotomy that was given to us by, colonialism, we have to start to critique and decolonize. And basically that is the whole thing we're doing on this project with GVF that I like so much. The categories, right? We are dealing with linguistics, we're dealing with language and how things are framed, conceptualization, these concepts and how they are framed. We have to find a way to try to decolonize them and make very insightful intervention. So at this point, I think Busi asked the question about the fact that one of the women mentioned junior husband and what it meant. I say maybe you can give the Ghanaian background and why the person would say that.
It's a cultural thing. So depending on where you're coming from, technically, when you're married to a man, his brothers, his younger brothers are like your junior husbands, traditionally. So for where she's coming from, Sandama, Upper West, I think, her husband's younger brother is the academic who wanted to take her property, and is the husband's younger brother who is her junior husband, especially now that the man has passed away. So that's English terminology, so junior husbands, for lack of a better word, but I'm sure there's a way in which, in her own language, when she says it, the meaning is close, but a bit different. But yes, because also for when you're marrying somebody, you're not just marrying the individual, you're marrying his whole family, his mother, his father, his brothers, his siblings, his aunties, and somebody will say even his. So, all of them, vice versa. So in this way, it really is just that younger brother. But yes, because in some other traditions, when you become a widow, you have to marry the man's brother, or he has to marry you. Yeah. But beyond that, there's the terminology that your husband's brothers are your junior husbands. Your brothers are your junior husbands. Yeah.
Right. So after the death of the real husband, the junior husband has the right of first refusal.
Yeah. Part of the strange widowhood rights. Some places do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that Ashraf's question was a triple-barreled question. And so, Sinfri, there was one to you. If you could, Prof. Makoni, if you would deal with that. Prof. Makoni, you're muted.
The way we have conceptualized the Global Virtual Forum publications are that we have these various books, but each book is supposed to be accompanied by a short 3-4 minute video in which we have got extracts from the interviews. It's taking a bit of time to produce the videos than the books. But that is one of the things that we are planning to do. The advantage of conceptually why we wanted to have these short videos is that for some people, they may just want to watch the video rather than read the book. So the videos will provide you with with more, people will be more willing to watch this video. And then pedagogically, the assumption was that in some cases, some students may want to watch the video and then they go on and read the book. But of course, the opposite may happen. They just watch the video and they are happy with it. So that is, but the most important thing is that we are using different modalities. The key issue which I need, which keeps me awake at night, is really the issue about the film. Not so much the videos, not so much the book production. I think those are moving fairly well. It is this other venture that is closely tied to the Global Virtual Forum, that is the idea of the film. Hence my questions at the beginning, what advice they could give us. I'll try and see if one of these days when we have time that we meet with the organizing forum of the GVF and try and say to ourselves practically, what is the next step? So that this idea just doesn't keep, we don't keep coming back to that idea, but we don't do anything about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Makoni. It looks like we don't have any question in the chat yet, and there's no hands up. I think our time is really running out. We are already in after party, so if you can stop the recording now, and those who want to stay with us for after party can go on talking about